After I shot the Hitachi Mpegcam video, I was editing it and I discovered that I had shot 10 solid minutes of information on the history of digital video and still digital cameras, none of which was germane to the subject. I really thought it was when I wrote it, and then when I was editing it, I'm just like, none of this really leads anywhere. So I just cut it all out. But if you're curious, so as usual, I'm going to try and give you a little bit of history, some context so you understand why this thing was significant, and then I'll go into all the functional tests and whatnot. Lots of us work with digital video on the daily now. I mean, we all have phones that can shoot 4K 60 and edit it and process it and send it around to people without a second thought. I mean, it's just completely casual now, and it goes without saying this is the endpoint of a very long and complicated development process, but also one that didn't necessarily take a straightforward path from beginning to end. In fact, the path was and is so muddled that terms that meant something for decades now no longer do. For the longest time, the term digital camera meant a device that took still pictures, while camcorder meant a device that took moving pictures, whether digital or analog. Now, however, those terms are almost meaningless and interchangeable. When we shoot video on our phones, we use the same camera module that we use for high-quality stills. And the video I'm making right now is being shot on a camera that looks the way that still digital cameras did for 20 plus years and includes a lot of their design elements, yet it's sold exclusively as a video camera. Meanwhile, there's a ton of productions going on right now being shot on cameras that look like still cameras and are very good at being still cameras and are partially marketed as still cameras. Yet they shoot nearly cinema-grade video. In fact, a lot better than many of the dedicated video cameras that are still on the market. It's a weird situation, but it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. What is a motion picture camera other than a still camera that can shoot 24, 30, 50, 60 times a second? So it was inevitable that digital still cameras would evolve into digital camcorders, but it took way longer than you might think. The earliest thing that could be called a digital camera was produced in the late 70s as an experiment at Kodak. It was based around a fairly new technology called a CCD, which feels like a very digital device if you read about it, but in reality isn't digital at all. It takes an image and converts it into a grid of evenly spaced dots, which feels very much like a pixel array, but these aren't really pixels. They're analog values, which the camera circuitry has to convert into numbers if it wants, which this one did. This camera saved images as a stream of bits representing a low-resolution black and white image, which it saved to magnetic tape. Now, this was never marketed. You couldn't actually buy one of these. In fact, you couldn't really buy one at all until the very late 80s, and as a consumer, not until the early 90s. In between those two dots on the timeline, 1970-something and 1990, you could buy a lot of stuff that used a CCD sensor to record images, none of which was digital. For instance, in 1983, you could buy a video camera that used a CCD sensor, and by 85, they were going into camcorders, all of which were also analog. They sampled the image as a grid of dots, and then converted it into a continuous waveform before writing it to tape. Later, around 1988, you could start buying devices called still video cameras, which, as the name suggests, recorded still images using electronic means, and in fact also used CCDs, and were also not digital. In fact, despite taking what look like floppy disks, they still recorded an analog signal. Each concentric track on the disk recorded one field or frame of analog video, no different than what was being written to videotape at the time. When 1990 rolled around, you could finally buy the first consumer digital camera, the Dicam Model 1, also sold as the Logitech Photoman. It was the genuine article. It took a photo at low resolution and in black and white, but it saved it as a series of bits representing each point in the image. So finally, digital photography was available, and the camcorders remained analog. In 1990, the best videotape you could get was probably still High 8, which, despite being considerably different than VHS, Betamax, and EIA-J before it, still basically stored a television signal, which in turn was based on a standard designed in the 30s. So still photography had taken its first steps into the 21st century, while videography was still lodged in nearly the 19th. In 1984, Apple put out the QuickTake 100, one of the first color still digital cameras. So finally, as a consumer, you could buy a device that would let you take ordinary, everyday snapshots. It wasn't very good, but at least it was moving forward while videography remained steadfastly analog. Finally, in 1996, as digital cameras were skyrocketing in their capabilities and resolution, digital video hit the market with the aptly named DV format, a videotape that allowed camcorders to save their video as a series of images represented by bits. So, a true digital format, and it offered many of the advantages that we're used to from digital video. You can move it around losslessly between computers, between decks, between camcorders even, and it's a lot easier to edit, and it's higher quality than any analog format was. However, it didn't quite usher in the workflow that we expect from digital cameras because it was still a tape format. That meant it was linear access. You had to move forward and back by winding the tape forward and back. You couldn't just jump from one place to another, and the tape could very easily get damaged, degraded, even broken just from playing it. So while DV was digital, it didn't really give you the modern digital camera experience. We expect our media to be random access, indestructible, easy to handle, and DV didn't offer any of those things. And nothing else did for quite some time. The dedicated digital camcorder, as we know it now, failed to materialize for almost another decade, and by the time it came out, it had been beaten to the moving picture punch by digital still cameras. In 1995, Ricoh put out the RDC-1, a digital still camera that offered the first video mode. It shot at 764 by 480, which was actually a little better than DV, but it could only shoot 4 clips of 5 seconds each, total of 20 seconds, so not a replacement for your VHS camcorder by any means. And while digital still cameras continued to get better and better movie modes throughout the 90s and 2000s, they never really measured up to camcorders. Digitizing video may have been a solved problem by 1996, but storing it wasn't. A mini DV tape storing 60 minutes of video contains about 12 gigabytes of data. Now, if you wanted to buy a hard drive or a flash card that could store that much data in 96, I don't think you could at all. I don't believe hard drives of that size existed yet. Or if they did, they were full-size 3.5-inch spinning disks that required a couple amps of power to run. Nothing you could carry around with you. And flash media didn't get past a couple megabytes. It wasn't even an option. Even if that Ricoh camera had been extended with 5 flash card slots, the way that Panasonic eventually did with the P2 to deal with their own storage density issues, it wouldn't have gotten past a minute or two of video at best. It just wasn't practical. This is why camcorders stuck to tape, because storage density is partially a function of surface area, and tape was the best way to fit the largest amount of surface area in the smallest possible space. For digital camcorders as we know them now to really happen, there first had to be massive increases in the storage density of random access media, which wouldn't come for several years. However, as I've mentioned several times before, while the consumer electronics industry nowadays is a bunch of cowards, they used to be mad lads that would make incredible strides of technological progress in order to produce a product